Mr. Taranto, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks. Sorry, I had a little trouble with the phone.
I know. I noticed you worked for the City Journal, so I've just spent the last few minutes praising the Journal and many of the issues that they deal with at this point in time. But let's get to some of the stuff. I've looked at some of the stuff you've recently written. A lot of it's been on the issue of racism in this nation. But I think my first question, I assume you did this because zeroed in on some of these thoughts because of the Martin Luther King event this past week. My first thoughts are to ask, what was your impression of the Martin Luther King event the other day?
Well, I can't say I watched it, but what I read about it was that it was, as celebrations of the anniversaries of speeches generally are, it was pretty lackluster. It seems that it was a one-party event, right? There were a lot of Democratic politicians there, few or no Republicans. Apparently, this was because it was not because Republicans weren't invited. Both Presidents Bush were invited, but they had to decline for medical reasons. John McCain apparently was invited, couldn't make it. Boehner was invited, had other plans. I can understand why a Republican might be hesitant to appear at an event like that because expecting a hostile reception, although probably it would have been a good idea for some of the Republicans to make an effort to go.
Well, I think it would have been important to point out to have someone there, some wise man of the party or a former president, to point out that it was the Republicans, led by Everett Dirksen in the U.S. Senate back in the early days of the Johnson administration, and Jerry Ford leading minority leader of the House of Representatives. They provided the votes to put the Civil Rights Acts over the top, while Democrats, the old line Democrats that were down there, were voting against it. So Republicans made a major contribution to passing that, while many Democrats sat in their hand. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, that's somewhat true, although I think Republicans tend to overstate this. I mean, it was liberal Democrats like Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson who took the lead in this. It had wide bipartisan support. The only real opposition came from the South, which at the time was still dominated by Democrats. So the Democrats at the time were the party of segregation, but they were not entirely the party of segregation. The Northern Democrats were pro-civil rights, just as the Northern Republicans were.
Well, let me ask you this, going to some of the things you wrote this week. You point out in one of your articles that there is the complaint that there is now an exodus of African Americans from the inner cities. I live in New York State. If you look at New York State today, 1.2 million people have voted with their feet over the last decade and moved out of New York City and out of the state of New York, primarily because of the economic decline of the state. Is it fair to say that African Americans are moving out of the inner cities for basically the same reasons?
Well, for a couple of reasons. This was an odd complaint that was made by Charles Blow, the columnist at the New York Times. Yes. He said,
I find most of his stuff odd, but go ahead.
Yeah, there was a great migration of blacks from the South. Of blacks lived in 1900 to first northeastern and midwestern cities in the early part of the 20th century, and then between about 1940 and 1970 also to western cities. Now, what happened then after 1970 was there was a reversal of this pattern, and blacks started leaving for the suburbs and leaving for the South. And of course, the reason they did that, colors leave states where opportunities are dwindling to go to states where opportunities are greater. The opportunities were in the big cities in the early part of the 20th century, and now they've moved south. But the other reason is that what drove blacks out of the South before 1965, 1970, namely the brutal system of Jim Crow oppression, was no longer there. And so this is actually, in addition to being just a sign of economic change in terms of which part of the country is dominant, it's also a sign of the success of race relations. It's a sign of progress, and Blow is tendentiously trying to read it the other way.
All righty, I thank you. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Hope we could do this again and get into some more detail of some of your most interesting columns, and I enjoyed reviewing them today. But thank you for joining us. And this is George Marlin, and this is the Steve Malzberg Show on Newsmax TV. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.